because you're not everybody, you're just
I am your everything.
And red flag, one for 100.
Don't be the bully.
Okay, so hi everybody, welcome. Today is another book club live stream. So we are going to be talking about the new and improved Loving Dominant, which is a book all about being dominant. It's kind of like the first book that we read for the book club, which was Conquer Me. That was like a book all about submissives and submission by submissives. And this is kind of like the dominant version of that. So this book is like a guide for dominance, although I think, especially now that I have actually read it, I think it's something that also qualifies as a pretty good one-on-one book, and it's also something that I would encourage people who are exploring submission or considering submission might want to read as well, because it does go into a lot of things that are submissive focused, like, you know, red flags, or like questions to ask the dominant or ask the partner, and lots of all those good things. Audio might be muffled or fuzzy. Let me change the direction of the microphone. 1 second. It's not in the waiting room. Oh shoot, you're right. I went to the... I'm dumb. I went to the wrong chat. Let me fix that. And also fix the microphone because it got turned sideways. I forgot that I went to the locked waiting room because I'm silly. So hopefully I should be able to hear you guys. We're trying out these like Bluetooth speakers, and I don't know if they're going to work or not. So I'm going to actually scroll down and see if I can. We have a very interesting setup going on here. Oh, for some reason it has you guys muted, and I don't know why. Okay, Ultra 2 just got unmuted. But Rinko, you're muted. I don't know why. So you might want to look into that and see if you have push top settings or what that is, because I need for you to be saying something and then not be able to say it.
Have you been able to hear people?
No, nobody said anything as far as I know.
Okay, Ultra 2 just talked.
Oh yeah, I just heard somebody.
Awesome.
It's weird because these headphones don't actually go in my ears, so it feels like somebody's talking in my head.
There may or may not be a scene planned around us.
What? Oh, okay. I understand now. I understand.
Anyways, you have a good time. I'm playing with my new toy.
What's your new toy?
A new tablet.
Oh, you got a new tablet.
Yeah.
Oh,
Tablet's like home.
so it's like a Windows thing.
It's basically like Surface for Chrome OS. This is a tablet.
Well, I won't tell certain friends of ours.
Yeah.
the maybe purists of a different variety. Anyways, it's mild but constantly fizzing, it sounds like.
Is everybody experiencing that?
I don't know what
Or those in Discord?
like people specifically on the YouTube chat
Okay.
have said this.
Okay. What's going on?
Is this still happening? Everything's turned on that I know, right?
Yeah, everything's turned on. Sometimes turning it off and then on.
Or if we just fucked everything up and then we have to restart the
We usually don't have to restart.
Everyone is saying yes, 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 yes. I just got a bunch of yeses. I don't know what that means.
Oh, that it's bad or that it's good?
I don't know. I just that it's still happening, and apparently there's like some kind of fuzzy noise. Now somebody's saying it's good. Oh, okay. I think the microphone needs to be closer to me.
Okay, we can do.
Will that work? I mean, I don't know what kind of microphone this is in terms of how directional it is, so hopefully this will be better. I don't know. Sorry guys, I'm like taking cornifer off of the microphone because surely that helps the audio quality.
And this will actually help you
in 2 weekends. Just use that by itself. Clip it on.
Oh, okay. I love having so many devices attached to me.
Welcome to the 21st century.
I don't like it!
But that way we don't have to worry about the batteries fucking working on it. The reason we've got that is when both of us are talking. Okay.
People are still saying it's fuzzy. I don't know if it's still fuzzy now that it's changed.
Yeah, give it 2 seconds.
It's really high and hot. I don't know what that means.
Hot means a little more, isn't it?
Why would that be though? We just changed the batteries and it's on. And I mean,
We did just change the batteries. Let me see if I can listen. If I can, something may bump like the volume setting or.
it says there's still fuzz in the background. Everybody says it's better, but it's still fuzzy.
Yeah.
What would make it fuzzy though? Unless it was like there's like a pass filter that we don't have turned on that we normally do or something. Could also be because the fucking door is open and it's like background noise type fuzzy. I don't know.
This is pretty low background noise level, so I would be surprised.
I do normally film next to like a busy street, so.
Yeah. That's how loud that room gets. I can't believe my landlord was like, oh, you should use that as your master bedroom. Alright, I am going to tap in and hear. So.
Okay, people are saying it's way better. I don't know if you can hear anything that indicate betterness.
It sounds good.
Okay.
I can hear.
People say, but I don't see you. So does that mean I can't see if I'm on screen? I am on screen. So that should be a thing.
I don't see you.
Really trouble, like you can hear every movement and breath. That's probably because it's close to me because now it's clipped on my body.
I see you. I see you.
Okay, I think if you're having trouble seeing me, you may want to refresh the stream. That's just my guess. I'm gonna move over further this way.
For the people giving us feedback, keep in mind you're like 10 seconds delayed. So if you can just thank you for helping, but add like a little bit more context, like yes, it sounds fine, or yes, it still sounds fuzzy. That way we can just sort of fix that. But thank you, everyone. I think we're good. Hopefully we're good. Yes, my voice is going to be echoed. I will stop talking.
Ba-ba-da. Okay, great. People say they can see me now. Okay, great. So I'm going to assume that our audio issues are done. Unless something else happens, in which case we'll address it. It always starts with tech troubleshooting. Well, it's because we don't have a consistent setup. We have to assemble all of these parts every single time we live stream.
I'm pretty consistent, but yeah, we don't have everything like plugged in and ready to go.
Yeah, so it's always something. So yeah, it happens. Sometimes it's more than others. Usually during the book club ones, it's the worst.
Yeah, and you can hear your Discord folks?
Yeah, I can still hear them.
And people on the stream can hear the Discord folks?
I don't know.
Okay.
But before I kind of test that, and we'll figure out how that's going to go. Yeah, actually, how would people, if I'm just hearing it through the headphones, how are other people hearing the Discord?
OBS.
Oh, okay.
So OBS is streaming the desktop audio. So if
I can't hear it, so I'll have to blame you. So anyways, I want to go ahead and get into today's topic.
Can you just have the Discord folks maybe just say, hey, can other people hear us? And then get confirmation people can hear.
Yeah, so if people in the Discord chat could currently, like if you can say hi or just something, and then we can confirm that people on YouTube can also hear you. That would be awesome. Okay, I'm going to see, can people hear the folks in Discord? I just heard somebody say hi. Okay, so I think people can hear.
Awesome.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is like a really, we have like 2 laptops. I'm logged into Discord in 2 different places right now. We have a camera hooked up to a laptop that's hooked up to OBS, it's hooked up to a microphone, and it's the whole, I'm wearing Bluetooth speakers so I can listen to Discord on a different laptop. And it's a whole system.
Do people? I can whiteboard with my new toy. I can.
We should do diagrams for the next live stream. We'll do diagrams. We'll do the Mr. Text diagram show. I don't know. And this is all the ways that you can fuck up your relationship.
Yeah. So let's say your poly network happens to look like this.
Yeah, exactly. All of the different permutations of poly networks. So let's draw that out.
We can talk about algorithms. Like if we do a min cut We can compute the in-out.
No.
Sorry. You do your book club.
I want to do my book club. I want to do my book club.
I'll be you're probably drinking a little bit. Probably.
Getting belligerent.
Bullish.
Okay, so as I've tried to start saying a couple times, this is the book club. And we're going to be talking about the new and improved Loving Dominant. Welcome everybody who is here. I do not want to be a cyborg. That is a falsehood. That is not true. Anyways, we are reading the new and improved Loving Dominant. And it's a book about dominance and becoming a dom. It's sort of like how to be a dom 101, although I think it's also a really good book for people who are interested in the other side of the slash, people who are switches. I think if you are newer to BDSM and you're interested in dominance or receiving dominance, it might be something that's worth reading. And today we're going to be going over some discussion questions and just talking about the book in general. If you want to join the chat, if you want to contribute your thoughts about this book, ask questions about the book, whatever, as long as it's related to the book in some way of the topic we're speaking about, you can join the Discord chat for the book club in the description box down below. There'll be a link for it. And then when you go to the book club chat, go to the book club waiting room, and you can go in there, and then you can contribute your thoughts and follow up the chat. Keep in mind while you're doing that, though, there is a delay between YouTube and Discord, so you can't have both open at the same time. Or you can't have audio going for both at the same time. Like if you mute the YouTube live stream because you want to keep up with the chat, you should be able to also do the audio for the Discord, and it shouldn't cause a problem. It's just going to be weird because there's like a 5-10 second delay between YouTube and Discord and this. So just keep that in mind. It may drive you crazy to try and have both open at once.
We don't yet have like graphics or whatever to pop up on the screen. We're not like H3 yet. So.
Maybe one day. Maybe one day. Why would I need graphics for popping up on the screen?
Well, if you had like a highlighted section of the book or something.
Oh god, yeah, like that would take way more effort than what I'm currently able to prepare for this. Maybe one day. I also don't know, like, aren't there like laws around like showing pages from like published works? And like there's like a maximum that you can share, like some sort of weird copyright thing.
It's not a maximum, but you're able to share copyrighted materials for the purpose of commentary.
That's true.
So.
Yeah, but YouTube algorithm bots don't care about that.
I don't think the algorithm bots are smart enough to pick up printed pages.
On a live stream?
Yeah.
Maybe. Maybe not. Anyways, so if people want to follow on with the questions, they can do that in the links down below. There's a link to the discussion questions for this book, and as well, there is also a link to the voting for the book for next month. So if you didn't already know, we choose a different book every month to read on a BDSM related topic, and usually I just pick one. But there were a couple of new books that came out this month, and ones that came out in like the last like month or two that I've been thinking about reading, and I couldn't decide between them. So if you want to contribute and share what books you are interested in reading, there's 3 choices for next month that you can vote on. The voting for that ends in about an hour and a half from right now, so you need to vote on it quickly because I do want to make sure I get to announce this next book before the end of the live stream. And there's 3 choices. The next book that we're going to be reading is either going to be Tongue Tied by Stella Harris, Untangling Communication and Sex, Kink, and Relationships. So it's a guidebook to better communication in your kink and alternative relationships, and asking about what you want. The second one is Thinking Kink, The Collision of BDSM, Feminism, and Pop Culture by Catherine Scott, which I think could be an interesting read. It's a little bit more on the academic side than the other books that we've read so far. It's coming from an outside perspective, so it's not written by somebody who's in the community. It's more anthropological, I guess is what I would say. It's a book written by somebody outside of the community who's making observations about the intersections of all these different things and how it relates to the BDSM lifestyle. From what I've read from the reviews, it is supposed to be a very neutral stance. It's not somebody who is overly negative about sex or BDSM, And it's also not somebody who's a diehard BDSM advocate. So I think this could be a good book for kind of understanding how people in the larger world perceive BDSM and kind of what our role is in BDSM as BDSM people for like making that representation. So that's the second option. And then the third option is one that's been on my reading list personally for a long time, although I've never gotten around to it yet. And that is Enough to Make You Blush, Exploring Erotic Humiliation by Princess Kali. This is pretty much the book, besides Midori's book, about humiliation. There's like those two, and if you're interested in humiliation, it's got to be one of those two books, if not both. So if you're interested in learning more about a specific kink, we haven't really done a book about a specific kink yet, so I wanted to throw that out there and kind of see how interested people were. There's a few other ones that are out there that go into specific kind of subsections of BDSM outside of just like power exchange. So there's ones that talk about like spanking. There's ones obviously that talk about humiliation. There's ones that talk about femdom. There's all those sorts of things that are kind of more topic specific, and I want to see if people might be interested in something like that as our next option. So those are the three choices. If you want to vote for our next book, you can do so down below. And again, that is going to be done in about an hour and a half. So make sure if you want to have a say in the next book, you do so very quickly. Normally, I would leave it until the end of the live stream, but I want to make sure that because of how quickly the time is going, that we actually have a chance to make sure that people know to vote. And welcome everybody in the chat. Oh, and also something I should mention. You don't have to like verbally participate in this conversation. I know not everybody is comfortable with like public speaking or having their voice associated with talking about BDSM. If you want to, you can either go to the Discord chat, and in the book club chat room in the text, you can write out your responses and things. Although I would recommend, if you want to do just the typing part or you want to contribute your thoughts written down rather than orally, I would recommend doing that in the YouTube chat, because that will also play side by side with the video after this is already live, so it'll be like easier to kind of have your thoughts out there. And then I will read out people's thoughts. If you type them, I will read them out, so that way they're kind of part of the ongoing conversation if people want to have that happen. That's a nice sweater. Thank you. I was checking to make sure everything's still good with the audio.
Was it a sweater we got last week?
Yeah.
I guess we got some.
Yeah, I mean, it is a sweater we got last weekend. That's right.
It's real cute.
It's warm.
You got socks?
I did get socks. They were on sale.
Did you bring them back with you?
I brought them home, but I brought a pair back with me.
So it's really cold. It's getting colder.
I'm gonna freeze my little booty off. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the questions. Are you gonna close the door for the siren, or?
That's no one.
It definitely sounds like it's coming from over there.
Well, I thought I heard it. What?
Sorry, siren. Simon, interrupt our book conversation. I can still hear it. God, it's almost like they want sirens to be heard from like through walls and stuff. It's almost like that's how they're designed.
We are in a large-ish city.
It is true. Well, I mean, I'm not, but anyways.
You are right now.
Yeah, currently that's where I'm at. So my first question for people who read the book, or for people who are in the process of reading the book, maybe didn't finish it, what I want to know is kind of what was your perspective going into this book? Were you hoping to get advice for your dominant partner? Are you a new dominant yourself who's looking for advice? Or are you looking for tips for looking for a dominant in the future? Or was it something else entirely? So for those of you who are in the Discord chat, I would love to hear your thoughts. Also, Alejo Feliz, you are muted. So be sure to check your settings, because if you want to say something, I want to make sure that you are able to do that and aren't muted. So for those of you who are in the chat, please let me know what was your kind of perspective getting into reading this book? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I kind of had a similar frame of mind going into it. I mean, really as an educator, I really like reading books just to find out if they're going to be helpful for other people and if they might be something that are good for other people to look into, depending on what their relationship with the BDSM world is, let's say. But I think mostly what I got out of it was, and we'll talk about this later, is I really liked all the appendices, and that was what really drew me to the book, is beyond just talking about what's a dom, what's a sub, what's power exchange, how do you find a partner. They also added a lot of additional information for actually kind of building your lifestyle, which I thought was a really interesting thing to add in a book about dominance, because I think compared to the submissives, there's a lot of sort of things that dominants are expected to do, like cleaning. They're usually the ones responsible for making sure the toys are clean. They're usually the ones who are responsible for finding toys, making toys, creating a dungeon space if they're home, if they have regular play partners, you know, knowing safety things, being well versed in like first aid, stuff like that. And I thought it was really great that they included some of those things, and so I was interested in seeing how all that would play out in this book. Does anybody else have any thoughts about how they got started reading this book and kind of what their perspective was? I didn't hear the Discord audio. People are saying they didn't hear the Discord audio.
Oh dear. Okay. Let me see what's going on.
We're gonna check on that. I'm sorry, guys.
Everything.
It worked last time.
It did work.
Is it because it's Bluetooth?
Changed a little. I didn't even want Bluetooth to be a part of how they get the audio. Okay. Are they able to hear now? I see your like little voice pop up.
Yeah. I don't know, can people, I mean, they're going to hear me because I'm on YouTube, so it doesn't really do any good for me to say something.
Oh, sorry, are you saying people aren't hearing the Discord people speaking?
That is what, that's what people I think are saying is I didn't hear the Discord audio, was that just me?
Okay. Okay, so they're talking and you can hear it.
I'm sorry, what was that? Is it possible? Oh, okay. It's possible that they may also be too quiet. I don't know. Are you able to see the audio levels for?
Yeah, I actually had like the desktop audio turned fairly down, so now I've upped it. Have them talk a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe Rinko, if you want to start out just to kind of test to see if this is working, do you mind repeating what you said about your perspective going into reading this book? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Somebody said audio is coming through on Discord but not on YouTube. Somebody said I can barely hear it, it's very faint. Okay, so I think it's a volume issue.
Okay.
Not a not hearing issue, just a volume one. Also, my hair looks so crazy with all this stuff in it.
Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the tiniest bit. Okay, so they're starting to hear the t
Yeah, and I can hear very clearly in my headphones. So if it gets too loud, we're gonna need to turn. I don't know how to. Do these have a volume adjust?
Okay.
What's up, Buttercup?
I'm wondering.
Hmm.
I think what I'm trying to do isn't gonna work.
What's the alternative? I mean, we could always do it so people like type out on YouTube, and I just read out the comments if it's gonna be.
Last time we were getting little transmitters.
Oh.
I know what it is. It's you. Give me
Ah,
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
This is a shame. Because I think when it's on to Bluetooth now, OBS isn't hearing it.
So it is that. Well, it wouldn't be like if I could be where that laptop is and just be plugged in directly to it. It wouldn't be a big deal. But it has to be up there because that laptop gets overheated. So if it's on my lap, it's gonna die.
I mean, we could see. I mean, I've got headphones that reach.
Yeah.
We might need. Let's do this. Bring your bed around.
Ah.
We're gonna get your bed. I'm gonna get the headphones and we're gonna get this working. We're doing it.
Are we?
Okay.
But sir, my laptop battery is still funky, and so if I'm afraid if I unplug it, it'll die during the live stream.
What's your laptop charge?
40%. I can try.
Let's try. Let's give it a shot.
Okay. Sorry, guys. Wow.
Bring your bed around to where the table is.
To where the table was?
Well,
So am I
what's the
sitting?
temperature?
How am I arranging this? Is this going in front of the couch, like I'm sitting in front of the couch?
Well, it's temperature now. This is long, but it's not infinitely long.
And then what about the camera?
Well, fix the camera.
What about the camera? I don't know. Ah.
Okay. Here you go. Hand me your other headphones.
But I have to get my laptop.
Yeah. Okay. Your laptop. Anytime I'll look up, all the way out. I'm sure there's a way of doing it. You want me to angle the camera down or drop its height?
Oh, don't angle it. If you cool. Just drop it down as low as it will go, I guess we'll have to just.
Oh, it'll go well.
It is? I don't know. Hi, everybody. There's a delay, so I can't.
I'll probably need to angle it just a hair. That looks good, right?
Yeah, I like this. This is nice.
Okay.
I'll scooch towards the center, I guess. Everybody gets to see my big old face.
Let's keep face. Okay, people in Discord chatting?
I don't know. I can't hear anybody, but it doesn't mean that they're not.
Yeah,
We've just been quiet.
Okay, I can hear them now.
Yep. And I think YouTube can as well. I guarantee it.
Oh no, we've guaranteed something. That's how we know it's all gonna go wrong. Can people hear? Okay, people said yay with a bunch of exclamation points. So everybody can hear. Okay, people are saying they can hear. And this is actually significantly less technology than the other thing that we were doing.
The problem is we do this once a month, and so it's like, I mean, you remember when we were first doing these live streams, like, everything was like fucking new, and we were fucking with shit all the time. So,
Gotta innovate.
yeah.
Gotta keep the...
And actually, I like your face is like super cute. The background is super blurry. So.
That's good.
I love it.
It's a good, no fuzz anymore. Okay, that's great. Okay, I'm glad. I'm glad. Look at that. Okay, so, I guess, let's pretend like the last 10 minutes didn't happen. This is my first time asking the question. Hey, everybody, 30 minutes into the stream. We're going to be actually starting the topic because, yay. So, discussion questions for the new and improved Loving Dominant. The first one is, before you were reading the book, what was your perspective getting into this? Were you looking to get advice for your dominant partner? Are you a dominant who is looking for some guidance or some advice? Or are you looking for tips on maybe what to do when you're looking for a dominant in the future? And again, I know that you guys in the Discord chat have said this a couple times, but if anybody would feel okay repeating it just to make sure that everybody on YouTube and in the future can hear this, it would be really appreciated.
I have a few words to say.
Yeah?
Yeah. When I first read the book, I thought it would be good for my dom to read it because he's new. But the more I read it, the more I found that I also benefited from it because I learned new ways about cleaning toys and more about poly and the importance of it and what it is not and things like that.
Definitely. Yeah, I kind of had, I know people already said this, but just for the, already heard this, but just for the sake of like continuing the conversation from square one. I kind of got into this because, I mean, one, I'm an educator, and so I'm always looking for books that I can recommend to people regardless of what side of the slash that they're on. Obviously, I'm a submissive, so most literature that I would be reading for me is going to be submissive based, but I think even as a submissive, there's a lot of things you can learn from reading about dominance, and I think it's important to kind of know how that feels, especially when you're newer to BDSM, because I think if you're just a submissive and you read like submissive focused literature and you don't really kind of read about what it takes to be a dominant, it's easy to end up in a situation where you, I don't know, like you don't have an idea of like what a real dom is like you kind of end up with more of a fantasy idea of what dominance is about or what dominance takes or what it looks like, rather than kind of learning more about the reality of being a dominant from an actual dominance perspective. And so that's kind of why I think this is something that submissive should read, and why I was particularly interested in about it, because there's surprisingly not really a whole lot of books out there just for doms. There's a lot of books about how to train your submissive, how to make rules, you know, having a female-led household, but there's not really anything about just being a dominant. The closest thing to that is there's another book called The New Topping Book, which is all about being a top. But it's not necessarily the same thing as being a dominant in a power exchange relationship, although the book does cover that subject. It's still not quite the same focus. So that's that. So those are, you know, some of the ways why somebody might want to read this book is, you know, if you're a new dominant, obviously, yes, this is a book made for you, but the author actually does a really good job and sort of the formative chapters talking about like, hey, you know, if you're a dominant reading this book, I'm going to go into this subject because I know there will be submissives who are reading this book to give to their partners, to look for dominance in the future. And I want to make sure that I'm addressing those subjects as well as we're talking about, you know, finding partners and establishing BDSM and all that stuff. So I really enjoyed that. The first big topic that I want to get into, and our time is a little bit limited today, so I want to make sure that I get to talk about some of the specific subjects in here. And to dams, if you're in the book club waiting room, you are muted and you also have sound off. So if you want to contribute thoughts, make sure you have those settings altered so you can say something if you feel so inspired. But the first thing that I wanted to discuss is something that the author brings up relatively early, I think in the first couple chapters, and that is specifically around the terminology of sadism. And I would be interested in knowing if people disagree or agree with this perspective, or if you have any additional like follow-up thoughts. So I'm going to go ahead and read this quote from that section. And for those of you who are just in the YouTube chat, feel free to follow up your thoughts on this as well. Even if you haven't read it, I think just having kind of a reaction to this section of the book is totally relevant, because this is a very interesting little tidbit, and kind of one of the first things I read that sort of tipped me off to how the rest of the book was going to go and kind of the author's perspective. And this is when he's talking about the various parts of BDSM that make up the acronym. So, okay, here's what B&D is, here's what S&M is, you know, here's what all these different terminologies mean. And what he says is, however, what bothers me about the phrase S&M is the S. The Marquis de Sade, as anyone who has read his writing knows, favored unwilling victims for his cruel activities, which were entirely concerned with his own pleasure and not at all concerned with consent. To me, this is the description of a sadist. Nothing could be farther from the spirit of the typical dominant, or top, who engages in an erotic dance of power with the submissive. While some dominants choose to proclaim that they are also sadists, I have noticed that even they will generally distance themselves from non-consensual practices. And since there are pathological sadists in the world, I prefer to leave this term to them and describe us as dominants or tops, because those terms are more neutral and less limited. After all, people are confused enough about BDSM play. We don't need to make the distinction more difficult. And that's what he says at the beginning of the book. So did anybody have any particular thoughts while they were reading that? Did that part of the book stick out at you at all? Did you have any particular feelings about the term sadist? If so, I would love to hear. Even if you didn't, if you were just like, yeah, whatever, I don't really care about the term sadist, it's not a big deal to me. I would love to hear what you guys think about that terminology.
I think in practice there's a separation between being a sadist and being someone who respects someone's consent and health. And you can be a sadist who doesn't respect people's consent and causes actual harm.
Yeah.
And you could be a sadist who doesn't. And those two things are basically independent of each other, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Did anybody else have any thoughts that they wanted to share? I want to get back to what you said and kind of go further along that discussion, but I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to contribute their perspective before we, you know, go deep into any particular thought, if that makes sense.
I don't know if y'all can hear me.
I can.
Okay. When I read that, I just thought that the whole notion of a sadist being inherently like linked to this historical personage or tied up in this idea that, you know, is very rooted in time and and is now a pathology. It's like, we don't do that for other terms in the scenes, so why are we focusing really strongly on the historical connotations of this particular title?
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, let's talk about that too, because I think that's an interesting point. So I can see, let's see, I think I see people contributing some thoughts in the YouTube chat, so I'm going to go ahead and read some of those. The Doty Monster says, I agree with his argument about Desaad, but I feel like sadist is useful. A top is not necessarily a sadist, and a dom is not necessarily either. Vince and Linda Taylor says, it's not a big deal to us, we just enjoy the power exchange. It's a modifier that's helpful, and I don't know that we have any other terms. Kitty Meggie says, but traditionally, especially in psychology, in those realms of studies, sadism has connotations of negativity, especially in the vanilla world. And then the Doty replies to that and says, yeah, I don't disagree. I guess I'm not ready to throw away the term sadist until we figured out another term. Yeah, I get that. I think if we're talking about the pathology behind the term sadist, we also have to remember that masochist is used the same way pathologically in like psychological analysis and in like the DSM. I don't know if in the the name is escaping me, the IB something, the IBN, I think, the European version of the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for mental health practitioners looking for diagnoses, basically, and the criteria for those diagnoses. Sadomasochism and sadism and masochism are used as pathological terms both. So if we're kind of arguing this from the perspective of we shouldn't use this term because it's associated traditionally with like a mental illness or with a pathology, you know, that decision has kind of been made for us, not just with the term of sadism, but also with the term of masochism. However, I would say that with masochism, the origin of that term is less fraught, I guess, than Marquis de Sade's writings were. And in addition, I think the community has come up with more alternative terminology around masochist. For example, pain slut. I know a lot of people who use that term as a self-identifier or use kind of similar language but don't necessarily use the term masochist specifically. And when it comes to the Doty Monster's point about a top is not necessarily a sadist and a dom isn't necessarily either, that was one of the first thoughts I had as well when I was reading this, is instead of the word sadist, I use the term top or dominant, and here's kind of my thoughts around that. Kind of when I first saw it, I had a gut reaction of, no, that's not right, because not all tops are sadists, obviously. But I guess we could sort of think of like, okay, here's like dominant, top, master, all of the different like titles of D types, right? And then there's sadist is like nested within those terms. So somebody who is a sadist could also identify as a top, even if not all tops identify as sadists. Although I think, and I do specifically know people in the community who are primarily motivated by enjoyment of causing pain of others, it is a helpful term to have in order to make that distinction when they are looking for partners. Because a lot of times top just means I like doing BDSM play, and that could mean maybe you're a service top, maybe you do high protocol. And I think sadist is a more specific term, where if you primarily identify as a sadist, people in the community are going to kind of have a quick snapshot of like your motivations, your desires, who you might be looking for as a partner, those kinds of things. But it's not necessarily always a good thing to like have a quick snapshot to be able to make a quick judgment all the time, because of those assumptions that get made based on how these terms are perceived in the vanilla world. I don't necessarily know though if changing the terminology from sadism to something else would necessarily erase the negative connotation, because most people this is why most people in the vanilla world, even a lot of people I'm sure that are mental health practitioners who are using these terminologies in like diagnostic criteria, they don't know the origin of the term. So the bias isn't coming from the fact that they know Marquis de Sade wrote books primarily focused around non-consensual torture. it's because the term sadist itself has evolved in relation to the people that become associated with sadism, like serial murderers and rapists and things of that nature. And changing the term maybe would help us separate from like the non-consensual sadists, but I think there is a difference once you are in the BDSM community between a non-consensual sadist that's somebody who's pathological, somebody who's a murderer, somebody who violates people's consent, versus somebody who's a sadist in the BDSM sense. But again, because people don't really make that distinction in the real world, I don't know if maybe it would be a situation where the BDSM community would form its own terminology, but then the vanilla world wouldn't know about it, and so they'd never adopt to it, and so they would continue to refer to BDSM activities as sadomasochistic, even if, and continue to judge us based off of that language, even if we changed internally to use another perspective. Does anybody have any follow-up thoughts to that? Any questions about anything I've just said?
I think the issue isn't just the term. It's the fact that if you're not a sadomasochist, you find sadomasochistic behavior inherently offensive.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely true.
Like, I've gone and done quite a bit of research into the legal situation with sadomasochism in England, because that's where I live, and there's quite a lot of legal stuff that's happened there. But what you see is that a lot of the people who are grappling with issues have really hard time believing that masochists exist and are actually masochists, and that this sadomasochism that they're seeing, which in the case of the legal case is really quite extreme, is actually just healthy consensual sadomasochism.
Yeah.
And it's not abuse.
Yeah, so it's just being able to understand at a basic level that this could ever be a consensual activity. And so there's really not any, you know, in order to be able to even have a conversation about like the origins of the term sadist or masochist and if they're like good terms, it doesn't really matter, because on a basic level, regardless of how you're labeling it, the activities themselves are inherently offensive to some people. Obviously, I should add an asterisk there, because it's not offensive to me, because I understand the nuance of like human expression and like how some of us find really weird ways to have endorphin rushes and adrenaline and some of us have interesting sexual response cycles that aren't necessarily traditional, let's say. So yeah, I think that's a good point. At a basic level, you know, regardless of how you label it, people don't really see these activities as consensual anyways, or find them inherently offensive to the point where they could never understand that these people really exist. Whenever I go on videos where there's people who have done like a documentary about BDSM, or have done an interview with a BDSM couple, you should never go to the YouTube comment section of those videos, by the way. I would not recommend it, but I have a morbid curiosity about, you know, has the outside world become more forgiving or become more accepting of our lifestyle? And the answer, at least on YouTube, seems to largely be no, because you get so many comments from people who are still like, I could never understand why anybody would want to do this. It must be because they were abused as children. You know, this guy is an abuser. Why does he want to do this to women? You know, this is where feminism has gotten us to. Like, all sorts of like comments that are just like, they can never even kind of hear the words that the people are saying, where they're like explaining why they enjoy something, because it's so outside of their realm of understanding that anybody could consent to this and be a mentally healthy adult at the same time without like a lot of trauma in their past. And like, even people who do have trauma can still do this consensually. It's not like, you know, if you've had trauma, you have to get out. That's not it. But that anybody could want to do this and not also be insane is kind of where people at. They just don't even really get it at that level. So I see more people are typing, so I'm going to go ahead and read out some of those responses. So the Doty Monster said, I mean, every aspect and most terms we use in BDSM are pathologized. I think we have to reclaim them and continue to challenge anti-BDSM ideas the way lots of words have already been reclaimed. Evelyn says, seeing that my voice is wrecked, I'll just type. I think that the notion that we can push our new terms out to the broader world isn't feasible, but saying a non-consensual sadist is just a rapist. Let's see. Lexi says, I think no matter what we call it, it comes down to people being closed-minded. And Ryan says, would you say that there's still a lot of stigma around using the terms? So I think identifying in any way with the BDSM community is still stigmatized. If you come out as, but it's interesting because I think if you come out as being a dominant or a submissive, being a sadomasochist, being, you know, anything like that, or having interest in those activities explicitly, like saying, I like being humiliated, those are very, very much stigmatized, and instantly people go down the like, oh, you must be crazy, you must have mental trauma, you must have been abused as a child, all that is where people's thoughts go. So I think that is very stigmatized, but at the same time, I think in a very, very limited way, in a very narrow capacity, there is some acceptance for dominant and submissive behavior in the bedroom under the guise of it being part of a romantic sexual relationship, i.e. the 50 Shades of Grey bodice ripper novel type situation, where it's not really about accepting somebody's sadism or masochism. It's about fixing a broken person. It's about, you know, it's about being overwhelmed with love. It's about wooing somebody. It's about kind of taking the, it's like vanilla-izing BDSM actions, I guess. I don't know how else to describe it. But it's like you take the dressing of BDSM and then you insert vanilla desires on top of that. So, you know, you have the very traditional desire of wanting to be overwhelmed with the passion of your partner, and then you put a BDSM veneer on it as like a flavor for that activity because it seems like the most extreme version of having that, basically the most intense version of having that. And so I think in a very limited way that has led to acceptance of some very limited forms of DS, but even then for most people it is only accepted as a fantasy rather than as something that people actually do and form a relationship structure around that is not intended to be grown out of at some point. Does anybody have any follow-up thoughts in regards to the terminology around sadism? I'd like to make sure that we get to at least a couple other points in the discussion questions list. So I do really think this is a wonderful conversation, and I'd love to hear more about what you guys think about this section. But any last thoughts, any other things you guys want to say about this subject, please let me know, and then we'll move on to the next question. I also can't see who's in the Discord chat. See if I can pull that up.
Do you want me to pull it up over there?
Oh no, I got it. I realized I made it a different window and I forgot, and I was like, I hope that that's okay. Okay, I'm getting thumbs up from people, so I think we might be okay to move on to the next topic. Okay, so, and if people have other thoughts that come up that they like, oh shit, I meant to say this about that, we can definitely go back if people want to do that, because I think it's a very interesting discussion to have. So the next question that I have, and I'm going to see if I could pull up a quote for this, is from, see if I can search for this. I don't know if I have a way of doing this. It is, what did you think of Libby's section on submission? Do you think it's helpful to have new dominants read sections on submission written by a submissive? And for those of you who don't know, this book was co-authored by John and Libby Warren. John is the dominant in the relationship, and Libby is his submissive. And she wrote a section on her submission while in the book. as part of the book. And I'm gonna see if I can.
I think you just search.
I don't. Where?
Kindle. Just search in the book itself. I think it will give you your notes as well.
Hopefully. You're right. Notes and highlights. It doesn't pop up with her name. Sorry guys, it's like I'm on my phone and this is like difficult to do at the same time. Oh, actually, so a submissive writes about submission. So I'm just going to go ahead and give like the first couple paragraphs of this for context. So this is from Libby's perspective, and she says, I was quite squeamish as a child. So when I told my childhood friends I was going to study biology in college, they said, you? I can't imagine you dealing with bugs, guts, and gross things. It used to make you sick to your stomach to see a piece of old spaghetti in the sink. Well, yes, but once I was exposed to the lure of science, I just couldn't keep away from it. I'm sure I would get a similar or even stronger reaction if I were to share my interest in being a submissive woman. In my everyday life, I'm a strong, competent, and successful woman. Yet, even before I was exposed to my submissive role, I was called to it by my earliest childhood fantasies. My attraction to a submissive role is even stronger than the pull I feel towards my chosen professional life, because I was called to it from a place deep within me. I'm not sure how the seeds of submission were planted within me, but I am driven to nurture those seeds to full bloom by follow my bliss, as Joseph Campbell would say. So, what is submission to me? To me, submission is a desire to be special or significant. My earliest fantasies, as they were when I was very young, always involved being somehow chosen and desired. And that's kind of the beginning parts of that chapter. So if people have any thoughts about that chapter, things that they thought were interesting about her perspective or her story, I would love to know what those things are.
Anything with that?
There's one, Pokey.
I think that was a very beautiful section, and I feel like if a Dom wants to be a good Dom and not just a Dom, they should really, really understand what it means and what it feels like and why a submissive is a submissive.
Yeah, definitely. I know when I was reading that section, there were some times where I was a little bit like, this is a little bit too like woo-woo for me. She is a spiritual person. So if you are an atheist, then that may possibly offend you to some degree, and I don't really care either way. But it's a little bit woo-woo, but I think at the heart of it, the point of it is not so much about her specific journey as a submissive in BDSM, although I think it is very important to draw parallels like, okay, she's college educated, she's a German woman, she's successful, and she is also submissive at the same time. So it draws pictures of how submission looks in ways that don't make submissives look like doormats, or submissives are idiots, or submissive are all bimbos, or whatever. And it does a really good way of explaining how, I think, for a lot of submissives, again, outside of her specific story, about how deep the psychological need for submission can be in some people. And I think that is so important to realize as a dominant. And I don't know for sure if for a dominant person that psychological need goes as deeply as it does for submission, or if it follows a similar pathway. But I thought that the discussion was a really good way of showing like all of the thought processes around submission and around how you get started as a submissive, what the feelings are like, what the emotions are like. And I think that's really, really good information as a new dominant to have. Did anybody else have any thoughts they wanted to share about that section?
I think the thing that Libby shows best is that on one level, like, submission is a tool for her to express intimacy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important acknowledgement as well, and I think this book in general does a good job of recognizing that specific type or that specific drive in power exchange. Because a lot of the books, especially the ones that are top-bottom focused, don't necessarily frame it in the context of having an intimate, emotionally deep relationship. And I think it's important to recognize that. And there are some other books like Master Arcane's Igniting the Fire that also kind of have that same perspective about dominance. And I think it goes back to the title of like the loving dominant, right? It's not the harsh sadist. It's not the how to have a top with a big dick. Like it's how do you show caring and kindness towards your submissive? How do you foster a relationship that is based on a deeper level of intimacy? How do you have emotional closeness? And I think that's a really important conversation to have, because I don't know if people don't realize that like DS in and of itself can be its own form of intimacy outside of romantic or sexual connection, and it can also, in addition, deepen those things as well if they are all present at the same time. So Spooky Salem says, I love the description of submission she gives for herself. I think submission is often just describing of wanting to be dominated or wanting to serve and never really goes deeper. Yeah, I've noticed that too. I think part of that is not necessarily laziness, but rather that submission can be a very difficult thing to describe, in part because I think it's difficult to talk about in a way that doesn't make you sound crazy. And I got done filming a video earlier this week where I was trying to describe the concept of suffering as opposed to simply masochism or just receiving pain. And while I was making that video, I kept saying things that I'm like, man, people are like, what if they just don't get this? What if I just sound crazy? And I think talking about your submission can be a really vulnerable place, because you're basically like, here's my open diary of all of my like really intimate feelings and needs for a relationship, and just like sharing that with everybody. And we also don't really have a lot of good terminology to explain some of those feelings, or we don't have like practice using that language, I guess I would say. So it can be difficult to talk about, and so it's really nice when people do take the time to sit and let all of their thoughts percolate and actually write out, here's how I got started as a submissive, here's what it means to me, here is how it interacts with my life, here is how it makes me feel fulfilled, and how it interacts with these other aspects of how I see myself. And that's really, really valuable to have. So there was also one other section. I can't see in my version of this book that I have on my phone right now if this is a separate section of that, if this is like nested in the same section, or if it's like the chapter immediately preceding. So there was also a section about SSC that I thought was interesting, and the whole conversation around consent I thought was really interesting. So maybe we'll talk about that at a later date. I can't find the thing I was talking about. There is a section in this book where Libby goes into levels of submission, which I thought was a really interesting way of conceptualizing of that, because oftentimes we talk about submission in terms of, okay, there's a top-bottom relationship, there's a dominant and submissive relationship, and then there's a master and a slave relationship. And those are like the three archetypes. Those are the three types of submissive you can be. Those are the 3 types of dominant you can be, or D type or S type if you prefer those labels. But in this book, there's like a whole section where Libby goes into 9 levels of submission.
You want this or you want to use it?
It says it's page 27. I don't know if that's actually the right thing. But does anybody remember that section of the book where she was talking about the 9 levels of submission? Or do you have any thoughts around that? And I did see that somebody had a thought about the last thing. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Are you talking about the 3 levels of fantasy, clarity, and transparency?
Yeah, so there's the 3 levels of... The part I was just reading said there were 9, and now I'm kind of wondering, is that a typo? Let me go back to that and see if I can search for it again.
It's in table of contents, levels of submission.
The 9 is about from Diana Vera, I think, rather than Libby.
Okay, yeah, that is... I just got to look at the full context of that paragraph, and I was like, okay, no, that's from a different book. Yes, I do mean the 3 levels of submission that Libby talks about in this book. So that's telling me that there's no results found.
You just want this?
I got it.
You got it, okay.
It took me a second. So I would love to hear people's thoughts. It's a really short section, so I'm going to read it out loud just so everybody has the context, then we can discuss it a little bit. So this is actually in the very first part of the book, and this is in talking about what scenes are and individual styles of scenes and all that stuff, which I think is in and of itself a really interesting conversation. But this section starts off with, another way of looking at conceptualizing the scene comes from my own dear Libby. Instead of considering the severity of the activities or the portion of the day they take up, her approach examines the emotional intensity of the submission and the degree of trust put forward by the submissive. She goes into detail about 3 levels of submission: fantasy, clarity, and transparency. And then this is actually, Libby's goes into it in more detail, but I also want to talk about something another submissive came up with in this same section, which is, inspired by Libby's format, another submissive woman offered her 3 categories. Unlike Libby's, these are not hierarchical in structure, but instead are based on the needs of the submissive. The first is stimulus-driven. Here, the submissive is taking part because he or she is seeking out a specific stimulus, like the pain of whipping or the confinement of bondage. The second category is relationship-driven. In this, the main desire is for a relationship, often with a particular person. Individuals in this kind of relationship take glory in the multi-channeled communication between the submissive and the dominant and enjoy the richness of that information flow. The final category is fantasy-driven, where the submissive seeks to make a fantasy or fantasies real. Sometimes this is accomplished by living through the fantasy. However, others find satisfaction in finding an individual who shares his or her fantasy and no specific action needs to take place. So those are not Libby's 3 specific categories, but ones that another submissive came up with. And I kind of like those ones because, again, they're not hierarchical. They're just different ways of describing the motivation behind submission. Did anybody have any thoughts that they wanted to share about those ones, or about the ones that Libby shared, or just the concept of different levels of submission in general? Oh, okay. And I'm also. Oh, go ahead.
So what were you going to say?
I was just gonna say I noticed some people commented back with their final thoughts to the last question. But let's go ahead and kind of like wrap up this section. We'll answer some of the things from the last one, and then we'll move on to the next thing, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, I mean, so the system that Libby has is this system of fantasy. What is it? Clarity, fantasy, transparency. I don't know which order they're. No, fantasy, clarity, transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Where it sort of transitions from, okay, we're doing this thing and we're pretending you're in control.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm effectively watching you to make sure you don't make me do something that I wouldn't be prepared to choose to do anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get the level of trust. The trust builds up, and you can start giving up on that need to make sure that your dominant doesn't abuse their position.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Libby finds that quite freeing.
Yeah, I got that.
I almost think like maybe the definition of a dominant is someone who undertakes to make someone else's decisions on their behalf and their interest.
Mm-hmm.
Which gives you two benefits. Which gives you benefits that it frees you from the restraints of having to make your own decisions. So there are situations where you might not be, for example, you might be in a situation where you can't make yourself do something. But if you have someone who you trust enough to take that power and make that decision for you, that can enable you to do things and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's
No, that makes sense. I know a lot of people who see the relationship between dominant and submissive as very much connected to the giving up of authority and the reception of authority. So for a lot of people, the motivation for submission and the motivation for dominance is based in being able to completely give up that authority to somebody else or to receive somebody else's authority. So I think I understand what you're saying there. And I can definitely see about how for Libby's particular type of submission, I definitely did get the feeling that her... my battery's fine. Thank you, sir. What was I saying? How Libby's submission is primarily motivated by being able to give up purely that which is passion driven for that which is primarily motivated by a deep trust. So it's not just about basic physical enjoyment, but it has transitioned to a point where it is now about being able to fulfill the other person through complete release of one's own authority, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and take some time to read some of the comments we got about the last one, and then we're going to go ahead and move on into the next subject. Kitty Meggie says, not only can it be so personal, but also sometimes it is hard to find the vocabulary in order to express your thoughts and feelings about being a submissive coherently. Definitely. I know that seems to be kind of an echoing theme throughout this from a lot of people that I know are submissive. It's like it's so hard to verbalize, and it's so hard to like find those exact words. So it is really nice to be able to have that kind of example in a book format. And Kitty Meggie also said, in terms of what we were just discussing, the fantasy as well as the actual giving up of control is one thing, but for me, it is also my dominant helping me become a better person, which includes motivating me to finish my novel. Well, that's great. I'm like, that's really cool. You're writing a novel, and I think that's like the other. I think these two perspectives kind of go really closely with each other. There's the dominance and submission is about making everybody involved a better person. And then there's the dominant submission is about being able to give up complete authority. And I don't necessarily think that those two ideas are mutually exclusive. I think it has to do with the emphasis you put on them. Because I think in order to have the betterment, that usually requires some kind of deep trust to be able to make another person feel okay, giving up the trust required to be able to have somebody dictate how you make yourself better. And then the other side, for somebody who is really motivated by being able to give up complete authority, they're kind of getting closer to their self-actualization by having another person control their thoughts. Like they're getting closer to their ideal self. And so through the process of giving up more power and having more trust, they are also going into a place where they can be their best selves. So those are just some of my thoughts. Let's go ahead and get into more of the discussion about the book. So let's see. I might skip around a bit here. So what I would be really interested in hearing about from people is the author goes over a lot of different types of play, a lot of which I've not really seen brought up in other books before. So were there any sections of the book that you read where they were going over a specific type of play or a specific type of BDSM activity or a certain relationship element, let's say, that you were like, wow, this is really cool, I've never heard this before, or just something you found really interesting, or maybe there was a type of play you'd never really read about before? If anybody had any kind of like aha moments when they were reading the book, or just had a section of a particular type of play that they enjoyed reading about, I would love to hear about that.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I found the part about like guided fantasy as something interesting that I hadn't really heard in this scene ever. So that one was completely new to me.
Yeah, I read, for me, actually, that was, in this book, that was the big standout section, which I think actually, when they start talking about play, that may actually be the first one that he really goes into in detail in terms of writing about how to do the scene. And you can tell that's like the thing he's really passionate about is guided fantasy. And for people who haven't read the book, I'm just going to give like a quick summary. It's not necessarily a hypnosis thing. It's not necessarily a phone sex thing. It's not necessarily a trance thing. Basically what it is you create a scene that is based around walking your submissive or your partner through a specific fantasy. And usually that could involve things like sensory deprivation. So the only thing that they're aware of is your voice. Or heavy bondage, or sensation elements that go along corresponding with a fantasy. And I thought the way that he described it was really moving and really interesting, again, because you could tell how passionate he was and how practiced he was at this one particular type of play. And it's one of those things where I'm not normally surprised by something anymore in like BDSM, and I wouldn't necessarily say I was surprised with this concept. I had just never really considered it before, and it was one of those things where I went, oh, that's like a new idea that I'm actually like really into that I've never thought of before. And it's really great to be able to have those kinds of moments when you're reading a book like this, because I think something that's really important when you are reading this kind of introductory literature especially is to be able to have those moments and have those like sparks of things that want to drive you to go out and learn more or give you ideas to practice something new.
I liked the part about Polly, and like how he described it in a realistic sense, because I know he said that people maybe want to dive into that to like, or don't go into it thinking that it's like, just, sex with a bunch of people, or just, it's gonna be easy, or don't do it if you think. I probably should just read the section, but yeah, I just really liked what they said about it, and yeah, I don't know how to describe it because I can't look at it through my thing.
Okay.
I like this.
I definitely agree with you. The polyamory section, I thought he did a really good job on. So I'm going to go ahead and Corgi's going to bark. Is there somebody at the door, sir? I guess not. Okay. Now that Corgi has had his moment in the spotlight, I'll just go ahead and I'll read kind of the first couple sections of that chapter because I thought there were a really good couple of ideas in that kind of just first part that I'd like to talk about, which is he has a section called polyamorous play, which I don't know if we want to call it play or not, but we are, so I guess I could nitpick at that. But he says polyamorous is another one of those cloudy words whose meaning seems to change depending upon whom you are speaking to. In the simplest form, it means having several partners for sensual play, and as such, it really doesn't fall under the BDSM umbrella with the same certainty as, let's say, flogging or bondage. But I'm including this section for two reasons. First, successful polyamory shares a number of precepts with BDSM, including consensuality and open communications. Second, there's a persistent belief that almost everyone in BDSM is polyamorous. I'll address the second one first. After many years in the public and private BDSM scene, it is my first belief that the majority of people who practice BDSM do so in the confines of a monogamous relationship. There are two facets of BDSM culture that tend to obscure this. First, polyamory is relatively accepted in this subculture. No one raises an eyebrow when a dom arrives at a party with two slaves on a leash, or when a dominant invites a submissive to join him and his partner in a three-person scene. It's accepted as part of the life, and for that reason, it's done openly and above the board. To people arriving from the vanilla world where such liaisons are generally condemned, and therefore conducted covertly, it seems that these people are everywhere. And then this next section I also want to cover too, which is for a polyamorous relationship to really work, all parties must be aware of what is going on and benefit from it. One of the great myths that dominants fall prey to is, I'm the dominant, what I want is what happens. This ignores the fact that submissives are neither cartoon characters nor legal chattel, although the latter can be a hot fantasy. As I've written before, a dominant who fails to take into account his or her partner's needs eventually ends up partnerless. Many doms have fallen on their faces when they allow fantasy to write checks their skills can't cash. Because of the observation that everyone else has multiple partners, or because it's just a hot fantasy, many novice doms feel they need multiple submissives to be properly validated. Nothing could be further from the truth. So I think that this section does a really good job of discussing two of the really big things that I see come up about polyamory in the BDSM world, and things that, like, I read this section and I was like, yep, these are totally things that I observe all the time. Like, actually, before I got to this section, but while I was still in the process of reading it, I ended up making a video. It's not out yet, but it will be in a couple of weeks, where I talked about the misconception around polyamory and BDSM, and basically that same thing about how, because polyamory is a lot more open than it is in vanilla world, that it seems like it's everywhere, or because people have definitions of monogamy that mean all emotional and physical exclusiveness, And so there are people in BDSM who play with other people or have multiple friends in a scene. And to them, that activity is not polyamorous, but it gets perceived as polyamorous. And so everybody gets the idea that, like, oh, everybody plays with everybody else. It's basically a big orgy. Everybody's polyamorous. When in reality, like, that specific setting where it's a club dungeon that has a membership is a very, very specific subset of the community. And actually, in reality, most people who are doing BDSM are actually doing it with monogamous partnerships. And so, when you go into that specific subset of BDSM, where it does seem like everybody is polyamorous, it can be really confusing, or it can feel like everybody is polyamorous. And so, you know, all the real doms have all these submissives, and so therefore I need to also have all these submissives. Or the equally unfortunate side effect of the I'm a dominant and this is how it goes because I say so, is there are, especially online, and this is something to absolutely be aware of if you are looking for a partner online, is there are unscrupulous dominants who will have multiple co-current partners without saying anything about it, and then when the other partners inevitably find out about each other, they say, oh, well, I'm just polyamorous, you can't judge me. Or, I'm the dom, you never said that I couldn't do this, you never, said that I couldn't have multiple partners, you just have to accept how it is. And that's not how good polyamory works. Even if that person is actually polyamorous and they do want to have multiple partners, it's the same thing as in the BDSM community. Consent and communication are always first. And so before you do something, you gotta talk about it first. So before you go out and you decide you want to have 3 different submissives, you gotta tell the first submissive before you go out and find all the other ones. You gotta agree to it. You gotta negotiate around it. It's not just a like, oh, well, he says he's polyamorous, so I just have to agree to whatever he says because otherwise I'll lose him. Like, that's not what an ethical dominant will do if they're also polyamorous. So that's my thoughts about it. Did anybody else have any thoughts about that section of the book, or maybe any thoughts about polyamory in the BDSM community? I need to get up for a minute to get my laptop charger, so I'll be right back.
I'll say something when you've returned. You back?
Hopefully my laptop is charging now. Okay, great. It is. Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Okay. Hello, everybody. I am back. My name's Evie. I have a laptop that likes to die during live streams. And now I have to do this. Everybody's going to get a little profile. I should probably put my headphones back on, actually, now that I'm back over here. Laptop, why? Okay. All right. Emma, I do this, and then it's like I can lean this way, and then people can still see me. So, what does the Emily say? Said, it has been interesting to see newbie, very, very monogamous couples get into our local scene and having to navigate and process what their definition of monogamy is versus mainstream force-fed monogamy. Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that happens a lot when you get into BDSM or you get into any sort of alternative lifestyle, alternative relationship culture. You get introduced to it is you suddenly have to question what monogamy means, because monogamy is the default, because the alternative to monogamy is what? Polygamy? Having multiple wives? Like, what? Like, it's not anything that people like really consider. It's just people, you get one partner and you marry them and you live life together forever. There's none of this outside relationship business. You settle down, you have kids, you do all that stuff with one person in your life. Always, always, always assumed that all of the major life steps are going to be taken with only one person. There's some leeway for like casually dating multiple people at the same time and, you know, not going steady yet, but like casually going on a date with a person and going on a date with another person, and that's kind of as far as it really goes. And I think there's this process that a lot of people have to go through when they are getting started in the community, through just being exposed to other relationship styles of how their relationship looks, because you kind of get like this example of a lifestyle you've never seen before, or a way of having a relationship that you've always told is like, that's cheating, that's wrong, that's bad, and then suddenly you get presented with this other way of doing it that is ethical, that is consensual, that is based in mutual trust and openness, and you have to go, oh, okay, well, if you can do all of this, or, you know, we can do BDSM and still be monogamous even if we play with other people, or we can be romantically monogamous and have sex with other people, or we can be sexually monogamous but go on casual dates. Like, whoa, what? Like, there's all these other different ways of doing monogamy, you know? But yeah, that's that section of the book. Did anybody else have any particular thoughts? I'm going to see if I can adjust this. Maybe I can't. I don't know. Is this a good idea or a bad idea? I don't know. We'll find out. Ah, don't look at the table. It's disgusting. Oh, okay. I don't know if that helps at all. We'll see. Mr. Midas made it to the stream. Hello. Welcome. So glad you could make it. So, anybody?
I was about.
Oh, go ahead. I think there's a delay, so sometimes I don't always hear when people start talking.
It is slightly hard with this sort of chat system. I think this polyamorous play section is slightly weakened by an assumption that he makes throughout the entire book. I don't think he ever questions it, which is he assumes that all BDSM is sexual.
Oh, we didn't even get to talk about that part yet, did we? Oh my gosh, we didn't even get to talk about... I thought I had that as a question, and maybe I didn't, but yes, that is a good point to bring up. Let me see if I can... I know at the very beginning of the book, I have a couple of sections highlighted where I was kind of like, okay, buddy, I can kind of tell that you... have a little bit of an how do I say it? A bit of an older perspective on what defines BDSM, and let me see if I can. Oh, and then he has, and kind of the same idea of kind of like, okay, I can see you're part of the older mindset is when he talks about SAM or SAM, which is a smart-ass masochist, and we can talk about that section too, is, so, okay, this is like one of the very, very first parts of the book, and he says, what is dominance and submission? It is a form of erotic play that takes place when one voluntarily gives up some or all of his or her power and freedom to another for the purpose of sexual excitement. For most practitioners, it is a kind of chocolate frosting on the conventional sexuality cake, an enhancement of expansion rather than a substitute for the genital sex. And to me, and I know how old he is, like I know when he got started in the scene, I know the perspective he's coming from, and this is very much the mindset of most people who are older and established in the community have it very much tied, even if they don't say it's genital sex focused, tied to sexuality in a very, very strong way where this is directly related to one's eroticism. And it definitely shows in a lot of the sections of his book where he is talking about, you know, like the guided fantasy section, sections on bondage. A lot of it is very focused on the erotic elements of that type of play, and I don't think that that is necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's kind of ambivalent, but I think it does kind of show how people have perceived of BDSM over time and how people relate to BDSM. Like, again, it's a very much like older mindset of BDSM is about purely like eroticism, and it's about the erotic connection of exchanging power. Whereas I think now, and especially in my community, we've kind of moved past the thinking of it in an erotic context to more about experiencing emotional depth and experiencing a wide variety of sensations rather than purely an erotic drive. And Kitty Maggie says, I know some newer people in BDSM think it is sexual, and that could be thanks to mainstream media as well as what could be found on the internet. And Mr. Midas says, yes, that's one of the things I marked off a few points for in my grade. And it can definitely still be that way. It's just not the only way. What does the Emily says, I mean, I hate that everything has to be compared to sex, when to me, BDSM is closer to intimacy, which I think mainstream and our old school kinksters view intimacy and sex as the same thing. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it's this connection that people have made that being intimate with another person means being sexual with that person. And I think maybe it has to do with how, you know, we're more accepting of casual sex, or we've untangled sex from romance more over time, or we can conceptualize different forms of intimacy outside of a pair bond, basically. And I mean, you can have pair bonds in a like polyamorous relationship. It's not monogamously exclusive to have pair bonds. But it's interesting to see kind of how over time I think it's sort of been separated, but it's not separated for all people. And so I think if you were reading this book and you were somebody who had never kind of had a sexual reaction to kink, like, I don't know how to describe this, I guess, but if you were somebody who was not interested in BDSM because they had a fetish, or, you know, you didn't have sexual fantasies about BDSM, but you found it very mentally appealing, you found it very emotionally appealing, you could take this to mean that I don't have a place in BDSM because it's not erotic for me. And I don't necessarily know if that's like going to be a common reaction, but I think there is a potential to read into this emphasis on the erotic aspects as meaning it is erotic, and so therefore if you have other drivers behind it, that is a weaker drive. It is not the main drive, and you can kind of take that to mean that you're like not as submissive or not as dominant, or that the lifestyle isn't for you, and it can get messy. So does anybody else have any follow-up thoughts to the discussion around like eroticism and BDSM and what's said in this book? So I think we only have like 20 minutes left in the stream, so I want to make sure that we give everybody a chance to share any of their key thoughts. So, Mr. Midas, I know you were coming to the stream late. So, what we've talked about so far is we've talked about specific parts in the book that we really enjoyed. We talked about his conversation around the term sadism specifically, and whether or not it's a good thing to continue using the word sadism. And then we also talked about Libby's section on submission. And so if you wanted to contribute any thoughts to that particular thing and you want to make sure that those get shared, you can type them out, or you can hop into the Discord chat, whatever works best for you. I know that you were like, I'm going to try and be here, but I might not make it. So I want to make sure if those were any topics that you felt passionate about, you can go ahead and share them. And then, let me see if there's any other comments about the last thing. Kitty Maggie says, sex is great, but intimacy can be such a closer bond than just a sexual one, as it is deeper, as it is an emotional bond rather than just a physical bond. Yeah, I can get that. I try not to make qualitative judgments about what is a deeper bond, because I think for some people, sex can be their main way of having intimacy with a partner, and for other people, the driver is primarily emotional. So I think it kind of depends on who you are as a person. It's not necessarily one or the other. And at the same time, that sort of means like, hey, don't just say everything is erotically charged, because it may not be for somebody else, but it still may be just as much of a driver towards being in a BDSM lifestyle, you know? And then what does the Emily say? Says, I wish people could view sex, intimacy, sensuality, all of that as separate things that sometimes overlap, but they don't have to all be entangled to be good. Yeah, definitely, I agree with that. And I think, like, this book, again, it kind of goes into the whole, like, eroticism and intimacy and BDSM, and kind of all of those get glommed together. And I think for me, especially with my experience being an asexual person, it can be very difficult to describe the separate experiences of intimacy. Like, you can be sensual but not be sexual. You can be intimate without being sexual. You can be affectionate without being sexual. Like, there's all these things you can do without having to be inherently connected to anything else. Mr. Midas says, one thing that rubbed me slightly the wrong way was that, to me, was the brushing aside of consent negotiation when he was talking about springing the anal play into partner with the excuse, oh, we're going to talk about this one, Midas. We're going to talk about this one. With the excuse that, well, she never explicitly said no. Now we don't know about their relationship. It could be that they already had precedent for that. Yeah, that was, let's go ahead and move on, because I want to make sure, you know, in fairness of giving a proper review of this book, I want to move on to talking about things that maybe weren't so great, or things we thought that we could be improved. And for me, I think, again, this has to do with the age of the author and sort of, I hate to be all, this is how he was raised, but over time in BDSM communities and in life in general, I think our ideas of consent and what that needs to look like has gotten a lot more explicit. And we used to see a lot of the stuff that happens in this book. That's a couple of different stories. There's one where he goes into a story about anal with a partner. Oh, Midas, it's okay. Like, at this point, we don't have that much left in the time for the chat, so I am totally fine if we skip around with topics, because I need to announce the next book and all the other stuff, so totally fine. But he has a couple stories that he shares where it's like, that consent was kind of dubious, and it's partly because he does a lot of mind-fucky type play, where he tricks the submissive into thinking that something's going to happen, then that it doesn't. Or they do a lot of things where it's like you think you're going to get one sensation and then you get another, or he convinces you he's going to do this one action, and it feels just like it happened, but really it didn't. And I think if you're playing with a partner like that and you're engaging them in the type of play, you have to have a level of pre-negotiated consent for those activities to be okay, and you have to trust your partner that they're not gonna mess around with your hard limits. And so when they say that they're going to brand you, for example, even though they've said that branding is a hard limit, they're not really going to brand you. They're going to facilitate that experience without actually doing it. But even that is like a little bit dubious, because for some people it can be so emotionally triggering to even have something that is similar enough to an activity that's a hard limit, even if it's not literally the activity, that it becomes disturbing or becomes a violation of consent. Because if your body can't tell the difference, how can you tell the difference mentally to like not freak out about it, you know? And yeah, he talks about a couple of scenes. There was one with the branding scene that he did that was very much a mind fuck type scene that was like, I don't know how consensual this was. And with an anal sex scene, with a couple other scenes that he talks about, I was like, that is like, this is like, I could read this story and the outcome could either be everybody was happy at the end and everything went okay, or it could have ended up being a story on FetLife where 6 months later the girl writes out the whole story of what happened and then just talks about how he violated her consent and how like she felt like emotionally violated, she felt, you know, awful about the scene, she felt like she wasn't respected, and like those types of scenes, especially talking about it to people who are primarily going to be new dominants, is like, I don't know, maybe we should just like wantonly be sharing these stories as like examples of scenes, because I don't think it does a really good job of giving the best possible example of what consent looks like. And I think there's a place for these discussions where we talk about situations where consent is maybe a little bit less clear, or where we've pre-negotiated things, or where you have blanket consent with a partner. But in a ground level, you know, 101 style book about dominance, giving people examples to go off of how dominance looks like without explicit consent in it is exactly how we end up with people who are consent violators and don't know that they are, because they haven't received the tools or been given the examples to know how to explicitly ask for and receive consent. Beg for a gentle dominant. Always got to do it. Always got to do it. What does the Emily say? So that's my thoughts. Did anybody have any thoughts about things that could have gone better in the book? Sections of the book they wish had gone into more detail? Anything, kind of critiques of the book in general? If you had anything that you would have liked to have seen, you know, seen improved or been updated, I'd love to hear what that is.
Going back to what you were saying about the whole consent thing. So my experience in the vanilla world is that a lot of people, on an intuitive level, get consent, and they do things that are consensual because of subtle and often subverbal negotiation. But they don't know on like a conscious level what they're doing or how it works. So they're in this really vulnerable place where they can't actually analyze, why is what I'm doing consensual, why is what I'm doing safe? Because people have, like, just intuitively really intense negotiations.
Yeah.
I have watched, completely subverbally, I have watched people have an effective discussion over whether they are going to hold hands simply by gingerly reaching out to each other's hands over the course of 10 minutes. It's the cutest thing ever. And I think he sort of has this problem. Because all of these scenes, I think we could assume, potentially, were consensual, because there was some subtle, unstated assumption about in the relationship that meant they were okay. But he never tells us what that understanding was. Yeah. And where it came from. I almost wonder whether that's because whether he knows.
Yeah.
Quite possible.
It's quite possible. Maybe he just doesn't know. He just doesn't know. He's like, well, she never said no, and she seemed like she really liked it, and she had an orgasm, so it probably was okay. Which is like, we've seen how that's like worked out, and it's kind of, you know, cover your eyes and just like hope, hope that it's okay. Yeah. So I think in vanilla culture, there is definitely this reliance on non-verbal communication skills, which are still very important in BDSM. And like, I do non-verbal communication all the time. Like, I do the same thing with the hand holding. Like, I still do it where I'm just like, I put my hand out and I put it slightly ahead of my partner, and I'm just like, if he wants to hold my hand, he'll grab my wrist. Because that's how we hold hand, is actually, it's not hand holding, it's him grabbing my wrist, but effectively hand holding. And I'll just like, and if he doesn't notice, I'll like make eye contact and like go down to my hand and be like, hey, I have an arm that you could grab, and that's like an option right now, and I'm like fully offering it at this moment in time. And there's that, and I think kind of it's the risk level of like having that be rejected or having that misunderstood is really low. And at the same time, that kind of reliance on nonverbal communication grows and goes into other facets of life, be they with negotiating romantic relationships, you know, how people like can be completely on the same page about like if they're dating or not. Because one person's read the nonverbal signals, be like, oh man, she's totally into me, we're totally dating. And the other person is completely just like not registered it that way at all. And it's just like, oh no, we just hang out sometimes. And it's like, you know, that kind of thing where it can be very, you know, same communication is happening in reality, but two people are perceiving it very differently. And I think what this book could have really benefited from is a section on nonverbal communication, or not necessarily having an explicit section, but taking these opportunities through describing scenes to point out areas where he knew that consent was happening, where he knew that his partner was still into it, how he checked in a scene, how he reaffirmed consent once the scene was starting, how he negotiated for the scene beforehand. I think this book could have really benefited from kind of those types of skills, in addition to just learning how to do the kind of play.
This is actually especially important given what we were saying earlier about sadism. We don't really have as much opportunity to screw this up as the vanilla world.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, so we're going to talk about how we want to really make sure that we're not being confused with non-consensual sadists, and then we're going to like not have a really good conversation about what consent looks like. And there is a section on consent. I don't want to pretend like he doesn't go into what consent looks like. He does, he talks about RAC, he talks about SSC. There are those kind of BDSM ethos that get brought up over the course of the book, which is great. But I think it goes back to, it's not something that's explicitly brought up. And I think having a up-to-date book, like more so than this one is, like having one that's like within the past year, there has to be a section on this kind of like nonverbal communication, how to establish, that kind of thing going into a scene specifically, so we don't continue to have that confusion around like, is sadism ever consensual? Do sadists care about consent? And I think having these presentations where consent is ambiguous makes it so somebody who is looking for an excuse to say sadists don't care about other people's well-being in any capacity to go, look, they never established consent. They never talked about it. He didn't care what she wanted. It was about him getting to continue to do the scene. And making sure you're incorporating kind of those unsexy moments is a good way of doing that. And I think it's something that we need more practice at, because we don't have a lot of examples of that kind of writing out there, so I don't think anybody's really figured out how to talk about it in a way that doesn't like lose the audience. So hopefully at some point we'll be able to have a synthesis of that along with talking about the hot scenes, but I don't think it's quite happened, at least not in this book. Oh, and Mr. Midas says the tie and the knot descriptions could have done with a lot more diagrams. That was, I think, for me, that was a section that was particularly annoying because it had no pictures and diagrams. I was using the Kindle version, so I don't know if there are pictures in the physical edition, but I find it like, I guess there are some people who are going to be able to understand that strictly through just being told in written format, but there is a reason why every single bondage book that is about bondage has pictures. And it's because most people are going to learn through visual media, through step-by-step directions, rather than just giving a run-on description of what a kanuki is or whatever. They were like, too, wow, that's like super, that's like so many, that's like really high effort. Like, and I think part of that is like, I didn't really get the impression that he was like a rope bondage focused person. I got more the sense he was a bondage utilitarian, which is I will use what works for the scene, and rope is just one of the many options I may choose to use. And so I think in that capacity there's less of it's more about almost getting it out of the way than it is like treating that one subject like really delicately and in full. And he does, and this is one of the things I did like about the book is at the end of the chapters he always recommends an additional reading or two that you can go to. And one of the books he recommends is Midori's book, and I think that's a great place to start for, you know, the erotic art of Japanese bondage is I think what Midori's book is called. What does... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the whole fun and games section has this challenge to it, but it's not quite sure what it's doing, because he has two choices available to him. Either, so you could write the section of here's all the cool stuff that happens in BDSM, without having to without and explicitly commit to not trying to explain it well enough so someone could do it just by reading your book. Or you can commit to I'm going to explain this in enough detail that someone who wants to do this can read my book, know what all the risks are, know what and all the subtleties that a full explanation would require. I'm never convinced he's quite worked out which side he wants to be on.
Yeah, it's like, how do I be complete, but not like dangerously complete? And I think there's a delicate line to walk in terms of responsibility, I guess, over your work. Like, and it's hard to know like how much do you share and how much do you not share. And I think he also has this problem with like tonal shift, and I don't really know how to describe it beyond that language, but like he'll go from like talking about spanking and then like in the same section or like in the same area he'll talk about like Nazi roleplay, and it's like, how did we get from like very safe introductory non-threatening roleplay to Nazis? Like, how did we and it's kind of like I can't quite tell if he's decided who he wants his audience to be. Does he want his audience to be people who already know about BDSM but that don't do power exchange? Or does he want his audience to be vanilla people who or new kinky people who have no idea what it is? Because I think if he meant this for a purely one-on-one audience, the idea that he would have ever even brought up like Nazi roleplay is very interesting to me, because I can't quite find the motivation for wanting to bring that up to a new to BDSM person, because there's so many other types of roleplay that you could have gone into, or like the choice to specifically talk about pony play but not about pet play in general, or the choice to talk about I don't know. There was just so many things where I was like, this is a very interesting assortment of topics that we have decided to go into. like, I don't even think he talks about flogging. Like, I don't think he talks about flogging at all, but he talks about golden showers, which is, like, again, it's a very, like, the tonal shift of, like, okay, who's the audience of this book? Is it people who already know about BDSM and people who have kind of more kinks, or is it, like, a 101 book for, like, a safe introduction to BDSM and the general most common things you're going to see out there? Mr. Midas says, I think he was trying to pick things across the massive spectrum and just didn't lay it out very good. Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made about, like, you want to give a largest sample of, like, this is what the BDSM world is like. But I don't think he does a good job of, like, ramping up the intensity level of the subject matter that he's talking about. Like, he's talking about spanking, and then, like, 2 chapters later, he's talking about shaving somebody's genitals. Like, there's a distinct upward shift in the necessary power exchange for, like, that kind of thing to happen. And it doesn't really, like, I don't really think it makes sense. I think it would have been a better idea to break down the fun and games category into several smaller sections. So, like, have a section on impact play, have a section on role play, have a section on humiliation play, have a scene on mentally based play, have a scene based on, have a section based on edge play, and have all of these things kind of be categorized in a way where I think they more make sense in relationship to each other, rather than going from spanking to Nazi roleplay in, like, 30 seconds. Which is, it's not exactly that close in the book, but it's close enough where I got, like, a how did we get here type of reaction from the discussion. And I'm like, how did we get to this spot that we're currently at? Okay, so we are... Oh, go ahead.
So what were you going to say?
I was going to say, we're almost out of time, so if people have any last thoughts, now is a really good time to share them, and I'll go ahead and I'll talk about what the next book's going to be. So if you wanted to say something and I interrupted you, definitely feel free to share it now, and then I'm going to kind of go up into final thoughts and then announcing the next book.
So the way I think I would have done the fun and games category is I would have divided it into 2. I would have picked out some specific, like, beginny stuff and gone, this is the stuff I'm going to explain well enough so you can read my book and you can go out and you can do it. And I would have gone that, and I would said, yeah, and you really go in depth about all the dig out all the subtle points that need to be dug out. And then I would have done the next section, which is all the crazy stuff that I don't have time to properly explain in this book, and where you need to go elsewhere if you want to do it. And I would have written that, and I would have written, focus on, why is this a really cool idea? And why do people do it? Why is it, why might you want to do it? And also, but why is it dangerous? So people can then go, no, because almost what I want is I want the list of risks, because then I have to go out and go, right, these are the risks if I do this thing.
Yeah.
Find a go, can I tick off all these risks as sufficiently mitigated?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. I think that would be a good way to, like, here's kind of at this level where I'm going to go into detail, and then if you want to explore further, here are some common things that you might run into, and here's why they might be interesting, and here's kind of some risks associated with those. Like, I think it's worth mentioning what water sports is. I think it's worth mentioning what knife play is. I think it's worth mentioning these things. But he just doesn't really have the time to go into detail, or like the section on like fire play, or like the section on first aid. And I think I have opinions about first aid, and specifically the first aid that he presents in this book, I think is an outdated. I would not take medical advice from this book, I guess is what as I'm going to say. Because a lot of what he talks about in terms of first aid is, to my knowledge, not the current best standard. Like, the current best standard is not slather it in Neosporin and keep a bandage on it for 4 days straight. It's less antiseptic heavy. He's very liberal with the antiseptic use in this book. And I think there's a time and a place for that. But I would not necessarily look at this book as a safety guide so much as it is a starting point for learning more. Because again, it is not necessarily super up to date. And he's not a doctor, he's not a nurse, he's not an EMT. He doesn't teach Red Cross classes. He doesn't necessarily know what we have learned is the new best practice. Mr. Midas says, I did glean some really helpful random bits of knowledge from the book. Suede causing abrasions, for example. Never would have thought about that. And then he also says he lived through the AIDS crisis, so I think the heavy antiseptic use probably stems from that. I mean, it could, but at the same time, like, if you've already, like, had blood-to-blood contact, antiseptic's not saving you from HIV. You know, I get the perspective behind it, and I think that's a really good point to make about why he might be thinking in that line of thought. But then we also have to deal with things like MRSA now, and having a dungeon outbreak of MRSA is a lot higher of a risk category than a dungeon becoming infected with, like, a bunch of cases of HIV. So it's something to consider. It's something to think about. I think that does make sense about kind of the rigorous antiseptic use. And, like, I also grew up in a very germophobic home. So I grew up with the, like, slather antibiotics on everything, wash your hands 8 million times a day type thing. And I've had to realize that, like, this is actually, like, it's doing more harm than good. And, like, you don't have to, like, spray yourself with Lysol every single time you, like, come in the door. So, I can see that, but it's not the thing. The suede causing abrasions, like, there were a bunch of little tips like that in the book, which I think were, like, probably going to be good aha moments for people who had never really considered things like that. And I think my main reason for recommending this book, if I had to pick a reason for somebody to read it, is I would refer them to the appendices. I like the beginning of the book. I like the appendices. The middle part, where he's explaining all the different types of play, me personally, I could have taken or left a lot of those sections. They're not the worst descriptions I've ever read. They're not the descriptions that necessarily always connect to me on, like, I totally get this is what this type of play is like for me sort of level. But the appendices go into a lot of really interesting things, like how to make toys, how to decorate a dungeon that you can convert for vanilla use on the fly, how to find partners. A lot of really interesting information that doesn't get put in a lot of books. So I think if people are interested in some of the things in the appendices, and let me just shout out what some of those things are. He has a section on, additional reading resources, how to clean after a scene is done, contracts, flagging, questionnaires, a glossary, how to make leather toys, how to record a scene, how to do in-scene photography, how to make a dungeon, party manners, scene behavior. I think all of those things are really interesting sections that are really good pieces of information that I'm sure for specific people are going to be things that they really want out of a book like this. How to buy a coffee table sturdy enough to be used as a bondage platform. Absolutely. That is absolutely a brilliant thing. So, I want to make sure that we announce what the next book's going to be because we're way over time and I'm hungry and I need to order dinner. But it looks like the winner of the poll, and I will put a link to where you can buy this book, is Tongue-Tied: Untangling Communication in Sex, Kink, and Relationships by Stella Harris, which secretly this is the one that I wanted to win because it just came out like 2 weeks ago. And it won by like 3 times as many votes as the next closest book. So clearly y'all are really passionate about this book specifically. So I'm very excited that people are feeling enthusiastic about this book. I will be editing the description of this video and I will be leaving a comment after this live stream is done and I'll pin it to the top, and in the future I'll talk more about this and announce it on social media of when our next date for the live stream is going to be. I think that our next live stream of the book club is going to be October 19th, Friday at 6 p.m. and I will see you all then. So again, thank you guys so much for participating in this. Thank you so much everybody who contributed your thoughts to the book. Thank you everybody who took the time to read this book. I really enjoy getting to share these books with you guys, and hopefully you are finding this interesting, finding it helpful to be able to figure out kind of what's worth reading, where should you go to look for more resources, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, and I will see you all again very soon. I am gonna go ahead and shut everything down. But again, thank you guys so much for participating. I loved hearing from you all, and hopefully you also enjoy the next book. I'm off the screen.